Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to the halftime talk, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Alex Vatanka, Director of the Iran Program and Senior Fellow of the Frontier Europe Initiative at the Middle East Institute. And Alex today joins us from Washington, D.C. Thanks very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Early hours of the morning there in Washington, and certainly probably lots of conversations going on in Washington as we speak about all these geopolitical dynamics that are keeping us entertained. But today we're going to be trying to focus our discussion on the region here where I am, the Middle East and Iran, and see the impact partially on the energy markets and on economies here in the region. This halftime talk is focusing on energy matters, but of course there's so much else that's impacting that these days. So let's get started. And Alex, I'd like to start by asking you a question about your impression of where the JCPOA negotiations are at. We've had around the nuclear deal with Iran, we had a few points earlier last year where we almost reached a deal and there was some positive sentiment. But by all accounts, that seems pretty dead in the water, doesn't it? For many reasons. And perhaps you could tell us if you agree with that or not, and why.
No, thank you for that. Again, it's great to be with you. To be honest, I've been covering this Iranian nuclear issue and stalemate pretty much since my professional career began. This has been part of anyone who watches Iran since 2002. It's been on and off so many times that it's difficult to sort of predict what is next. But this is what we know as of right now. The United States is still interested in a revival of the JCPOA. At least that's the official line. The same is true on the Iranian side. So what's keeping them apart? It's the nitty-gritty, it's the small details. Former President Hassan Rouhani just last week came out and said that when he was president, when his team was in power in Tehran, they were very close to a deal, and that it was the approach that was adopted by his successor, Ebrahim Raisi, that basically made that deal fall apart. So that is obviously something that would line up nicely with the arguments from the Washington side, which is that the Iranians, after Raisi became president, essentially over-negotiated. What that means to me is that the skeleton for a possible deal is still out there. The question is whether there's a political will on the Raisi and Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader side, to go back just a few years ago and revive what was pretty much a done deal then. Because here's the thing, and I'll stop there, but the reality is this Iranian economy is in a terrible, terrible shape. There are all sorts of alarm bells going off in Tehran that this is not going to be something they can sustain. So it's certainly in their interest to see if they can revive the deal.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, the economy is in dire straits because of sanctions. And until those are fully relieved again, we're not going to see any relief there. But of course, what we've seen also since in the last few months is the internal situation in Iran, on the ground at least, is that we have had these protests, pretty serious protests, a lot of internal stress there for the current regime, which you could argue has surfaced over the years. But is it more serious this time? And what effect is that pressure having on a possible incentive or not for the regime to proceed with this deal?
Frankly, if anybody has common sense in terms of being in a position of being a leader, you would have to admit to yourself that the protests that Iran has been experiencing since September, and by the way, they're ongoing. They're not necessarily at the same scale throughout the last few months, but they come up and go down. The underlying factors are there. There's a deep sense of disillusionment with this Islamist system. It's a failure of government, if nothing else. They just simply cannot deliver basic services to their citizens. So never mind the ideological argument, whether you want to live in a democratic Iran or a theocratic Iran, that put that aside. This system cannot deliver basic services, and that's basically why people oftentimes are out in the streets as well. There is no silver bullet, but certainly removing the sanctions would give them some, revenue. They will be able to sell and buy, and they're desperate in need of foreign investment. So there's no doubt in my mind that the protests are a factor. Again, if you're logical, if you're Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of the generals and the Revolutionary Guards, you want these sanctions lifted because that just makes sense. But then again, this is an Iranian system that doesn't often think in terms of logic. I mean, they're proud of saying economy is not their priority. They're proud of saying this is not why they're here, that they're preparing the nation for afterlife and so forth. So if they were going to think,
what they're doing is really trying to protect their own survival right now, aren't they? That's what they're trying to do.
Well, that's what they're right. So I mean, I would have thought, again, I'm thinking logically, if you want to survive, if you want to give yourself chances, listen to that young demographic in Iran, because that young demographic is extremely angry and it's not going to go anywhere. And it's just politically maturing now. So their demands for change are going to be part of political life in Iran for the next 2-3 decades at the very least.
Okay, well, I mean, let's see where that goes. But clearly there seems to be deadlock internally in Iran to an extent, and you're saying both Iran and the US want this deal to go through, but neither are really willing to it seems, to make the compromises that were made before, let's say, that when it was agreed to before Trump came along, at least, and President Raisi. Let's go beyond Iran a bit and just stretch out a little bit into the geopolitics of what's happening. One obviously development which has gone on now for 12 months is the war in Ukraine. Iran has openly, supported Russia in that conflict. The Gulf economies here and Gulf countries have not supported Russia, but have not also remained maintained a neutral stance, as has China. So let's take a look at the geopolitics of that a little bit. And again, let's look at Arab Gulf state, Iran relations a little bit. Clearly, in recent history, not in a good state, but we hear through the grapevine that that's particularly the Gulf countries and Saudi wants to improve relations for their own internal security reasons, apart from, and of course for economic reasons. Where do you think that's going? Is there a chance of a détente between essentially Saudi Arabia and Iran?
Yeah. Before I turn to the Gulf, very quickly, let me just remark on the Ukraine war and Iran's decision to supply drones and maybe ballistic missiles to Russia. Back in 2015, when there was a JCPOA, there was the issue of Iran's nuclear program. Over the last 6 months or so, because of the protest and the violent crackdown and the killing of hundreds of protesters, plus Iran's decision to openly side with Russia, has just made a nuclear deal that much more complicated, because the Iranians very effectively pushed the Europeans, who are more keen for a nuclear deal, into the American camp. So, if Iran really wanted a nuclear deal desperately, they would not have made some of these decisions, including supporting Russia the way they did over the last few months. So that's another major factor and question mark. In terms of Iran-Arab, the relations with the Gulf countries, number one to remember, as I always like to say, is there is no Gulf policy on Iran. There are individual Gulf countries with their own respective policies. Now, I know the Gulf Cooperation Council meets, they issue, communiques and so forth. But the reality is there's a big difference between, say, Saudi Arabia and Oman when it comes to what to do with Iran. So Gulf countries look at Iran differently. Some are driven more by security calculations and concerns. Others are more focused on potential for economic trade. A place like Dubai has always had huge economic relations with Iran after 79, before 79. So I think where the Gulf countries are, though, collectively, is the one thing they probably all would agree, or a couple of things. Two things that to me stand out is, number one, they're confused about U.S. policy. They don't know necessarily if they should trust the U.S. when it comes to, Washington's Iran policy. They put a lot of faith in the Trump administration. Those attacks happened in 2019 and 22. The response from Washington was not what the Gulf countries had expected. That left them disappointed, which means that they have decided to talk to the Iranians more on a bilateral basis. They have also tried to sort of look to other countries for potential security cooperation, including China and to some extent even Russia. So I think the worst case scenario for the Gulf countries, particularly since a number of them have now signed the Abraham Accords, is to find themselves being battle zones between Iran and Israel, or Iran and the United States. That's the last thing the Gulf countries want to see. So they need to have that direct line of communication with the Iranians to say, look, your fight with the Israelis and Americans, that's not our fight. And that's a very important message. And I totally have sympathy with the Gulf position on that.
Yeah, and as you said, the withdrawal, let's say, of the U.S. interference in the region did trigger the Gulf country. It has perhaps pushed them closer to wanting to do a deal with Iran. And, you know, all the better for the region if that can be done. I mean, let's talk a little bit about OPEC on that front, because again, Iran and some of the Arab Gulf states are in that organization together, and as is Russia in OPEC plus. And again, you know, people always say, well, OPEC is separate. You know, they all sit there and they agree on everything, and they put politics aside for that. I mean, do you have any opinion on where that sort of agreement or group is going? It's again, you've got Russia fighting a war, unilaterally declaring, you know, output cuts, perhaps in line with its practical ability to produce, and then of course you have Iran, you know, who's limited by sanctions, but as part of the group. How much weight does OPEC plus carry in any of the regional sort of relations that we're seeing and geopolitical considerations that we've mentioned?
Certainly from Iran's perspective, it's not a major factor, simply because Iran has become such a marginal, essentially a marginal exporter and producer and exporter. So, you know, this is a net result of Iran's foreign policy. They've become such a small exporter, certainly in the context of OPEC plus, that they don't even have to worry about quotas. The rest of the gang are happy that Iran produces as much as they possibly can. They're under so much sanctions. Nobody sees Iran as a threat. Certainly not Saudi Arabia, that probably, and I'm certainly no energy watcher as such, but I think Saudi Arabia is around 10 times the sort of production as Iran. So what the Iranians have in terms of their oil and gas, well, gas, they have huge potential in gas, but they're a major consumer of gas, and they have suffered from lack of investment for years. So they're not going to be when the Ukraine war happened, there was some speculation that Iran could quickly replace Iranian gas. Well, Iran has the gas resources, but it doesn't have the investment technology access to be able to turn itself into, say, a country like Qatar has been able to do. That's a result of Iranian foreign policy, of lack of investment, of lack of vision, essentially. And there is no Iranian economic 2035 or whatever vision that so many of the neighboring countries have adopted. There's no economic vision. They're not in the business of looking to thrive. They're in the business of surviving. And one of the ways they survive is, for example, their major oil customers, China. And the Chinese get something around 30% discount from the market rate, just because the Iranians have nowhere else really, with a few exceptions, Syria and so on. But Iran is not the kind of energy play it could be. I mean, it's a country that sits on 15% of the world's combined oil and gas. It's a superpower when it comes to energy.
But it has been restricted by its sanctions. I mean, that's really what's the ground for everything. What do you make of the recent visit by President Raisi to China last week? What do you read into that? Is it more China playing the game of showing this developing relationship, or who has more to gain out of that, China or Iran, do you think? For at least
to me, right. To me, it was more of a damage control. I mean, that was not a visit that was anticipated. Certainly, I might have missed it, but I didn't know that visit was coming. It wasn't being advertised. I think it came right after President Xi's visit to Saudi Arabia, where the Iranians were caught by surprise. Some of the statements that the Chinese leader made in Saudi Arabia were seen directly as opposing Iranian interest. So maybe the Chinese felt that, they had upset the Iranians a bit too much, and they invited Raisi, and he's desperate to begin giving limelight. So he shows up in Beijing. What does it mean in practical terms? Here's what you should know. China and Iran back in 2016 signed a 25-year agreement. It's supposed to be this $400 billion agreement for all sorts of Chinese investments in Iran. As of today, less than 200 million has been invested in Iran. So A lot of talk on the part of Iran that what China can do magically to turn the Iranian economy around, but the Chinese aren't going there because of sanctions, because of whatever number of reasons that's in the way. So, yeah.
So the sanctions are holding everyone. Yeah, we mentioned the US and its lack of support, let's say, to in terms of protecting some of the Gulf Arab interests when Iran has been poking with its proxy sort of battles and triggers in the region. And of course, many reasons behind that. But would you say the US is on track of a real withdrawal from the region? I mean, we had this 2 years ago, yes, the US is out, that's it, and that's what's triggered the Gulf and countries like Saudi to say we're on our own now. We've got to make our own policies here and make new relationships with China, etc., and with Iran eventually. That seems to have reversed a bit that US intention to kind of withdraw from all the disasters that have happened in the region when they've been involved. They seem to be kind of getting drawn back in.
I'm not convinced the United States ever really meant to leave the region. There was some talk of pivoting to Asia, the rise of China and so forth, but that was, I think, overdone by the Obama administration initially and later on by Trump. And I certainly don't think the Biden administration is guilty of giving the impression that they want to leave the Middle East. In fact, what you've seen in recent months is all sorts of visits by senior officials from Washington visiting the region, from Israel to the Gulf countries, talking about the commitment to their security. There's a desire here to expand the Abraham Accords. There's concern here in Washington with the new Israeli government, Bibi Netanyahu, what that would do to damage the Abraham Accords and put the Gulf countries in an awkward position. All these things suggest to me that the long-term U.S. commitment to the region is still there. But look, it's also a question of expectations. If you're a Gulf country and you end up in a war somewhere in the region, say Yemen, and the United States come in and do everything for you, do the fighting for you, make sure you have a military victory, well, that is a wrong expectation to have. You need to pay more attention to the politics of this town, certainly with the Democratic administration that came in on the commitment of, for example, on Yemen to sort of withdraw U.S. support, which hasn't really, in fact, happened. I mean, there's been more questions being asked by the Washington leaders about what the Gulf countries are doing in terms of a place like Yemen, but they haven't walked away from the military commitments to the Gulf partners, and that's the important part to remember.
Of course, the Gulf parties want to walk away from that war if they can. They're trying their best to do so, and yet, again, maybe perhaps being drawn back in because of what Iran is doing. Let's talk a little bit about Azerbaijan as well, because there again, everyone's focusing on Iran and Israel and the Gulf and Iran, but of course we have other tensions which with Iran and its borders, and Azerbaijan is one area where that is. And do you think that's having an impact on trade relations between the countries and further out, a ripple effect on their neighbors at all in terms of trade, energy flows, etc.? What's risk, the corridor of transport there?
So, I mean, the tensions that you see right now between Iran and Azerbaijan are actually probably the most important to watch, simply because there's such a not just geographic proximity between Iran and the Republic of Azerbaijan, but so much else in terms of religious affinity, cultural affinity, and so on. Just to put it out there, there are 10 million roughly people that live in the Republic of Azerbaijan and 20 million plus ethnic Azerbaijanis that live in Iran. So you can see that these two countries are actually connected in ways that Iran isn't, for example, connected to Yemen or Syria. So this is why it's so important. The Iranians feel that Israel and Turkey have become the dominant actors in the country of Azerbaijan, and that footprint could be something that Jerusalem or Ankara could turn around and use Azerbaijan as a platform against Iran. This is certainly something the Iranians fear. But to your point about what impact the tensions have on trade and so on, again, it's a classic example of failed Iranian foreign policy. If they had focused more on a nearby region like the South Caucasus and focused on trade and focused on reassuring the government of President Ilham Aliyev that Iran doesn't have bad intentions, you wouldn't have the crisis you have today. But what has Iran done the last 10 years? Expanding its sort of footprint through the proxies in place from Syria to Yemen, supporting militiamen, supporting a very kind of anti-status quo ideology. I mean, none of these militiamen that Iran supports in the region have economic plans. None of them have any ideas in terms of how to improve the livelihood, the living standards of the citizens in those regions where they kind of dominate or rule over them. So I think, we can talk about various aspects of this, but going back to it, you constantly see the same issue. It's a system in Tehran that is detached from the people in Iran. And I think it's a system in Iran that it doesn't really have much to offer a majority of the people in the Middle East. And there's a failed model, certainly when it comes to what it has to offer on the economic front. I don't see him offering much, and it's a set of lost opportunities. You mentioned the north-south corridor. I mean, Iran, Azerbaijan, and Russia were supposed to build this long rail and road network from the port of Chabahar on the Gulf of Oman all the way up through the Caspian into Russia in Europe to create a new trade route, to avoid the Suez Canal, to save costs for exporters and importers. Where is that today? Well, politics is in the way. That is not being developed. And again, yeah.
Yeah, do you think if the current Iranian regime did sort of get back behind the JCPOA negotiation and the domestic distractions calm down a little bit for a while to allow them to do that, I mean, is it something that would strengthen the regime or weaken it? Is it, and obviously if it would strengthen it, why haven't they proceeded to kind of reinvigorate those talks? Again, it's a chicken and an egg, isn't it? They need to improve their economy, but if they do, is that the end of their game, or is it, is that play for or against them? What's going to make this budge? When are we going to see some movement one way or another in stalemate in Iran?
Right. So sitting at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C., we're good at telling people what we see is happening, but we don't necessarily want to give people policy options. Well, we give them policy options, but not necessarily what is the best option or not. That's all for policymakers. In terms of JCPOA, look, last time around in 2015, where the deal was signed, a lot of people who supported the deal were left disappointed in that it didn't become a stepping stone to something bigger. It was supposed to be the beginning of a broader dialogue. So Iran would talk about what it's doing in Syria, and others would equally address some Iranian concerns. It wasn't going to be one-way street. Iran has security concerns. The rest of the region has. It was supposed to be the beginning of a conversation. The Iranians are the ones this Iranian regime that by and large has said, I don't want to have that conversation. I'm fine how things are in the region. Let's just talk about sanctions relief. And then in return, I will limit my nuclear program, which means Iran gets billions of dollars of its own money, but nonetheless, billions of dollars in sanctions relief, which then can get pumped into places like South Lebanon, to Hezbollah in Lebanon, or the Houthis in Yemen and elsewhere. It doesn't help the region. So until Iran decides what it signs a nuclear deal for, what is the long-term intention behind a deal? Is it a narrow deal that just deals with how many centrifuges they have versus how much they get in terms of selling oil? Or actually, this is the beginning of something bigger, turning a chapter, focusing their economy, being inward looking, and do what the Gulf states have increasingly done. I mean, you see countries like Saudi Arabia publicly coming out and say, we're not going to spend any more money in Lebanon. We're going to focus on the economy here in Saudi Arabia. We have a demographic youth bulge, and that's what we're going to focus on. Imagine if Iran did that. That would really turn things around. I think the neighborhood will welcome it. All the Middle East would benefit from an Iranian economy that was open and connected to the rest of the world. It's a market of 85 million, educated, extremely hungry for anything you can imagine in a capitalist market economy. The question is, will they connect? Because that's what the leadership in Tehran has to decide.
Decide on. They'd have to make a very big shift in the way they need that to happen. So it's a kind of court between a rock and a hard place. Alex, before I let you go, I did want to touch on Turkey. You mentioned it briefly just now. And of course, now Turkey it's the latest very challenging disaster of the earthquake, of course, to deal with. And that's going to impact Erdogan's elections, possibly in May, and what he's been doing. But one thing that Erdogan has been doing in the lead up to that May election, before at least the disaster of the earthquake last week or 2 weeks ago, was that he was trying to sort of play this new role of, the sort of geopolitical middleman between the Gulf and Iran and the US, etc. Trying to sort of play all the players, if you like, have that role for domestic reasons to show that he's doing that on the international stage. How fundamental do you think that was, really? I mean, was Turkey really playing any serious mediating role when it comes to those different parties?
Yeah, I'm not convinced that was the case. I think certainly in recent years. You have to go back to 2010. If you remember, there was a trilateral agreement between Turkey, Brazil, and Iran that the Obama administration ended up not accepting. But that was meant to be a proposal to solve the Iranian nuclear program back then, about 13 years ago now. But President Erdogan is busy with his challenges in Turkey. He's not necessarily someone the Iranians trust fully. He has, we mentioned Azerbaijan before. His support for Baku is one that the Iranians are worried about. And by the way, recently, as you know, Turkey has also normalized relations with Israel, Iran's chief regional foe. So I can go on and on. These are two rivals, Iran and Turkey, two regional rivals, but also rivals that on both sides accept that this is a rivalry that needs to be managed, because they do not want to have an open confrontation vis-a-vis one another. They happen to still be major trading partners, and neither side really wants to pick a fight with the other. So there will be competitions in places like the South Caucasus, in Syria, in elsewhere in the region, but neither Turkey nor Iran wants to see this competition get out of hand.
And do you think, one last question for you, Alex, the protests in Iran, they're still going on? They may have dissipated a bit, but will this be something that will reach a new conclusion, do you think? Or, everybody's saying these aren't going to stop now. That's it. People have had enough economically, politically, etc. Or could it be, in another few months' time that we see things again dissipate back into the sort of status quo?
Right. Like I think that there's no way back. There's no way back. I mean, the status quo is gone, and everyone, even in Tehran, accepts that. They know that they're on the wrong track. They know they have nothing to offer their own people. This is a regime that is best has 15% support. 15% support in a country of 85 million, when you think about the fact that they have access to the money and the guns, does matter. So it's now not a toothless regime. It has capacity to hurt back, and we've seen how they've cracked down on the protesters. But nonetheless, it's a question of time. This is a tide that is getting bigger. Ayatollah Khamenei is a notoriously stubborn person. He has never, in his 34 years now, ever apologized, ever accepted that he had made a mistake. And that approach is not going to make him any new friends. And that's exactly what the regime needs. The question is, will those people around Khamenei think about the day after he's gone? Because he's 83 years old, and eventually he will leave. Because there's a challenge for them and an opportunity to turn the page, to go in a very different direction, as we discussed here today, for this regime, because that's the only way they can prolong their survival. The Shah's regime that fell in 79 wasn't supposed to fall either. It was formidable, and yet it fell over the course of a year and a half. So who's to say that this regime is going to stay in power forever? Unless they change their ways, it's actually probably more likely that they will fall one way or another than be able to stay in power.
Okay, well, Alex Vatanka, we'll stop on that note. Alex Vatanka, Director of the Iran Program and Senior Fellow at the Frontier Europe Initiative at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Great speaking with you.